The night Rowan Hale was about to lock up his garage, a black sedan stopped in the rain. Blair Ashford, a CEO who had never set foot in a place like this, walked in alone, laid a silver key on the workbench, and said the words that would unravel everything. "My father sent me to do whatever you ask." Rowan did not reach for the key. He studied the envelope bearing the Ashford family seal, then asked one quiet question that drained the color from her face. "Is he still conscious?" Before she could answer, something heavy struck metal deep inside the locked hangar behind them. If you believe honesty always finds its way back to the sky, stay and discover what secret was waiting for both of them. Hale Aeroworks occupied the far end of a regional airfield in a small Colorado mountain town, a hangar that smelled of hydraulic fluid, worn aluminum, and the kind of honest labor that never quite washes off a person's hands. The building had no sign worth reading from the road. Just a rusted bracket where letters had once spelled out a name that almost nobody in the aviation industry still used in polite conversation. Rowan Hale had worked there alone for the better part of a decade, accepting repairs that larger facilities turned down because the margins were too narrow and the clients asked too many honest questions about what had been done to their aircraft and why. He was 42 years old, lean and deliberate in every motion, a man who could identify a bearing failure by the precise pitch of a sound before it registered on any diagnostic screen, and his hands carried the accumulated history of several thousand disassembled components. His eyes held the particular stillness of someone who had long since stopped expecting the world to behave in proportion to a person's effort. He had not spoken to anyone from the Ashford family in 11 years and had arranged his daily existence carefully to keep that record intact. The rain that evening arrived without warning, the kind that comes sideways off the Rocky Mountain front and turns a gravel lot into a shallow river in 15 minutes. Rowan was halfway through resetting pressure sensors on an aging cargo turboprop when headlights swept across the hangar wall and a black sedan pulled to a stop just outside the open service door. The car was too clean, too silent, no mud on the tires. The sort of vehicle that waited in front of board meetings for people who never carried their own luggage. A woman stepped out without an umbrella and walked straight inside without hesitating at the threshold, wearing a tailored jacket already dark at the shoulders from the rain, carrying nothing except a plain white envelope and a key that she placed on his workbench with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed the gesture many times on the drive over. She looked at him steadily and said, "My father sent me to do whatever you ask." Rowan wiped his hands on a shop rag and did not move toward the workbench. He recognized Blair Ashford from the financial press photographs that had accompanied her appointment as CEO of Ashford Aeronautics 14 months earlier. Sterling Ashford's only child, the last line of defense between the company and a board that had quietly debated a full strategic sale for several years. He had no reason to believe this was anything other than another chapter in the long story of the Ashford family managing the consequences of its own decisions. He told her to take the key and the envelope and leave by the same door, and he was already turning back to the turboprop when Blair said that her father had suffered a stroke 2 days ago. Before losing the ability to form clear sentences, Sterling had pointed at a photograph of Rowan kept in his desk drawer, written this address in unsteady but legible handwriting, and made Blair promise to do exactly as Rowan instructed for 72 hours. Outside, a flatbed transport truck was reversing toward the hangar with a Gulfstream G450 on its cradle. The tail registration N731 Alpha Hotel, visible under the floodlights in pale stenciled letters unchanged in over a decade. Rowan stopped. That aircraft had been grounded and sealed for 11 years, and the last time he had stood in its cockpit he had been the lead test pilot and senior flight systems engineer for what the company described as its most ambitious development program. He crossed to the entrance and examined the fuselage from a careful distance. The maintenance seals on the forward door were intact, and when he stepped close enough to read the certification stamp, he recognized it as his own. The mark he had applied before the company's security team walked him off the property for the final time. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of Sterling Ashford's handwriting, compressed and uneven from enormous effort, which said without greeting or apology that if Blair signed the acquisition agreement on Monday, hundreds of people could find themselves aboard aircraft that were not safe to fly. Rowan read it twice, set it beside the key, and then turned to Blair Ashford and told her his first requirement: turn off the phone, remove the smartwatch, and tell no one, not a single person, that this aircraft was here. Blair held his gaze across the workbench for a moment that stretched past ordinary silence. She was accustomed to delivering instructions in rooms full of people who competed to carry them out, and she was not prepared to stand in an aircraft hangar at 10 o'clock at night being told to power down her devices by a man whose name the company had spent years removing from its accessible records. She pointed out, with trained composure, that she was the chief executive officer of Ashford Aeronautics, and therefore the person whose instructions carried legal weight in any situation involving company assets. Rowan acknowledged this, and then reminded her that she had been the one to say, without prompting, that she would do whatever he asked. Blair held his gaze another beat, then set her phone face down on the bench and removed the watch. He laid out 4 conditions before either of them touched the aircraft. No contact with the Ashford executive team under any circumstances. No lawyers, security personnel, or assistants inside the hangar. Blair would personally assist with the inspection, not observe it, but participate, meaning she would be on her back under the fuselage with a flashlight if the work required it. And if he gave an instruction during any phase of flight operations, she would follow it immediately and without argument, because at altitude the only question worth asking was whether the aircraft was safe, and that question had never once paused to accommodate a negotiation. Blair agreed to all 4, not because she had run out of leverage, but because she needed to know what her father had been concealing and from whom. She changed into a set of used shop coveralls from a peg near the parts locker, rolling the cuffs twice because they were sized for Rowan's longer frame, and she said nothing about the adjustment. For the next 3 hours she did exactly what he directed, removed access panels with a ratchet wrench he had to show her how to use, transcribed component serial numbers into a handheld log, wiped hydraulic residue from a port valve while he photographed the lines behind it. The work was slow and unglamorous, and she did not complain about either quality, which surprised him more than he admitted. What he found inside the maintenance documentation was the kind of discrepancy that takes a full breath to absorb. Components listed as recently replaced in the official service history were, on direct physical inspection, original factory equipment that had never been touched. Someone had been systematically altering the records for years, with enough familiarity with the company's filing architecture to avoid triggering any automated review flags. Marin called while they were deep in the examination, a brief check-in from her engineering program across the state line, asking whether her father had eaten anything that had not come from a vending machine, and the warmth that entered the hangar during those 90 seconds told Blair something about the life Rowan had built in the space between the career that had been taken from him and the garage where he had ended up. She asked, carefully, whether staying in a town this small had been difficult after everything that happened. Rowan said that staying had not been the hard part. Inside the avionics bay, behind a panel that showed no evidence of recent disturbance in the maintenance log, Rowan found a wire harness that did not appear in any technical schematic for that aircraft, a thin white bundle, neatly routed and secured with clip spacing identical to the adjacent factory wiring, installed by someone who had known this airframe well enough to make the addition look as though it had always been there. He touched the bundle and felt the faint vibration of a live current, which meant this was not a remnant of a previous configuration, but something actively drawing power right now from an aircraft described as non-operational for over a decade. Blair leaned in beside him to look, and then the forward instrument panel came to life without either of them touching the avionics master switch, and the primary display read in steady green characters: "Maintenance memory locked. Hate. Hey all." Rowan stood at the cockpit threshold and looked at that message the way a man looks at something he wrote to his younger self and was not entirely certain he had wanted to find again. 11 years earlier, as part of the diagnostic architecture he had built for the test flight program, he had installed a biometric-secured memory vault in the aircraft's central processing core, a system designed to preserve an unaltered copy of operational data in the event that the primary flight logs were ever modified or selectively deleted. The authorization protocol required his physical presence and an engineering access code that existed in no company document, because he had decided not to file it, partly on instinct and partly because the program had carried a quality he could not name that suggested it deserved closer watching than it was receiving. He explained the system to Blair without embellishment, and she listened with the full and organized attention of someone who had learned the difference between listening and waiting to speak. 11 years before the night she had walked into his hangar, Rowan had been technical lead on a development program evaluating a next-generation pressurization module that Ashford intended to certify for its commercial line. During ground simulations and early test flights, he had documented repeated anomalous commands reaching the pressurization valve from the flight management module. Commands with no corresponding pilot input, no weather trigger, and no explanation in any version of the manufacturer's code. He grounded the aircraft 3 days before its scheduled demonstration in front of an international investor group that had traveled to Colorado specifically to witness it. The grounding cost the company a purchase commitment worth several $100 million, and within 72 hours, the official explanation had shifted from a precautionary hold to a documented engineering error attributed specifically to Rowan. The internal investigation concluded with a speed that left little room for examination. The report accused Rowan of improper software configuration, unstable professional judgment, and conduct damaging to the company's commercial interests. Sterling Ashford had reviewed the findings and signed the termination order, and Rowan had understood at the time, with a certainty that 11 years had only deepened, that Sterling had known the conclusions were not fully supported by the evidence actually collected. The FAA inquiry into his pilot certification was suspended in unresolved ambiguity because the company had declined to cooperate with several document requests, not the posture of an organization confident in its own account. Blair did not attempt to defend her father. She sat on the cockpit step with the logbook across her knees and looked at the floor for a long moment before saying she had been 24 when it happened, and had accepted the company's version the way most people accept accounts from institutions they have been raised to trust. Rowan said he did not hold that against her. What he held against the situation, he said, was the specific fact that a man had spent years managing his wife's illness on a mechanic's income because the people who knew the true account had found it financially inconvenient. Blair looked up at that. Rowan moved forward and told her what the vault data would reveal if they could access it completely. The anomalous commands had originated from a privileged administrative account, and the fragment of log data he had recovered before the sealing order was applied bore the account designation VC01, the legacy login structure assigned to senior executives in the period before the company's system migration. Blair was quiet for a moment, with a quality different from the earlier silences, and then she said the name the designation pointed toward. Vaughn Carrington had been the company's chief operating officer for 23 years, the man who had guided her professional development since graduate school, attended her commencement, and advised her on every significant decision in her first year and a half as CEO. The vault data was not a complete record, because the aircraft's full operational log only finished its right cycle above 30,000 feet in altitude, and the Gulf Stream had been grounded before reaching that threshold during the test sequence. Recovering the complete and legally viable evidence would require taking the aircraft back to operational altitude under controlled conditions. When Rowan stated this plainly, Blair's expression carried equal measures of comprehension and apprehension. Before either of them could respond to the implication, Rowan noticed the rear service door of the hangar standing open, and the folder containing his handwritten component notes had disappeared. The security camera covering the rear approach had been disabled for exactly 9 minutes, precise enough to suggest the person had done it before and understood the system's recovery time. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere on the building, which indicated a valid access code for the airfield service gate, the kind distributed to a limited list of authorized maintenance contractors. Rowan photographed everything methodically, said nothing to Blair about his conclusions, and spent the next 2 hours reconstructing what he could from memory, working under the assumption that whatever had been taken would be read by someone who understood precisely what the technical notations contained. A regulatory compliance officer arrived the following morning before 8, carrying a formal complaint alleging unauthorized maintenance on a certificated aircraft. The complaint was correctly formatted, comprehensively detailed, and attributed to an anonymous party, the profile not of a competing mechanic with a grievance but of someone with access to a legal department that knew exactly what language to use. Blair moved to intervene using her authority as the aircraft's registered operator, and Rowan stopped her and told her quietly that if she made any formal statement connecting herself to this aircraft right now, Carrington would know exactly where she was standing and why. Rowan produced his airframe and power plant certification, his inspection authorization, the signed maintenance agreement filed with the airfield authority on the night the aircraft arrived, and a complete operational log of every task performed to date. The compliance officer reviewed the materials, found no actionable violation, and departed unsatisfied. 2 hours later, Rowan received a loan review notice from his lending institution, an unspecified risk flag on the small business account he had used 3 years earlier to upgrade the hangar. The pressure was not subtle because the person applying it did not require subtlety against a single operator facility with limited legal resources. Blair said she could resolve the loan review with 1 call before noon. Rowan said that call would identify her to someone who would report her location and allegiances immediately, and that it would surrender the only advantage they currently held. Carrington not knowing the full scope of what they had already recovered. He told her to help him with the pressurization module, and she did, lying on cold concrete under the forward fuselage, with a penlight gripped in her teeth. At some point during the 3rd hour of work, Blair said that she had been given the CEO position primarily because her father believed she would keep the company in the family, rather than because the people around her genuinely regarded her judgment as authoritative, and that she had spent 18 months trying not to look directly at the distance between those two realities. Rowan said that being handed a seat did not require a person to become the particular version of themselves the seat was designed for. What they found inside the pressurization module housing was recent enough that the installation adhesive on one mounting bracket had not fully cured. A secondary processing unit with no basis in the aircraft's original design documentation, no entry in any version of its maintenance record, and no certification marking that would survive a professional examination. June Halstead arrived that afternoon in a borrowed vehicle, confirmed the certification stamp was a high-quality fabrication, and said the manufacturing code on the housing traced through 3 layers of corporate registration to a subsidiary entity that Carrington had established during a period when his financial records showed irregular consulting payments. June said the module was technically capable of interfering with the pressurization valve in a manner that would not appear as an anomaly until the aircraft had climbed above a specific threshold altitude. Blair caught the edge of a fastener bracket with the back of her hand while repositioning an access panel, a small cut that bled more than the injury warranted because her hands were cold. Rowan cleaned it at the workbench and applied a strip of medical tape without making anything of the moment, which was itself a way of making something of it. June received a notification on her laptop, read it twice, and told them that the board had moved the acquisition vote forward by 24 hours. They had 1 day remaining before the window for intervention closed entirely. The pre-flight inspection took 4 hours, and Rowan conducted it with the discipline of someone who understood, at a physical rather than merely conceptual level, that the distance between preparation and negligence at altitude could not be recovered in regret. He worked through the engines, fuel system, hydraulics, flight controls, cabin pressure test points, electrical buses, emergency generator, and standby instrumentation with the same systematic attention he had brought to every flight he had ever prepared. Blair worked alongside him, handing tools when he called for them, recording specifications as he verified them, entering figures into the log with the careful legibility of someone who understood that precision in a technical record was not optional. June established her independent monitoring station in a rented van at the edge of the secondary taxiway, connected through a dedicated frequency that bypassed the airfield's main communications infrastructure entirely. While they refueled in the pre-dawn dark, Blair asked why Rowan believed Sterling had expected him to help given the history between them. Rowan said he did not believe Sterling had expected help offered from forgiveness. What Sterling understood, he said, was that there was one category of circumstance in which Rowan Hale would set aside every legitimate grievance and do the work regardless of who was asking. The category in which an unsafe aircraft might carry passengers who had no way of knowing. Sterling had understood that quality clearly from their earliest months working together, and had understood it with enough confidence to send his daughter to a man who had every reason to close the door in her face. Blair said that sounded like her father identifying someone else's integrity and using it as his own instrument. Rowan said that was the most accurate description available, and that it was also the reason he was standing on a rain-damp ramp at 4 in the morning, instead of asleep with the phone off. Carrington called while they were conducting the final cockpit verification sequence, and Blair answered because Rowan had asked her to handle all calls normally, so as not to alter any behavioral pattern being monitored. Carrington's voice was the measured and unhurried voice of someone who had spent decades selecting words the way a careful architect selects load-bearing elements. Nothing decorative, nothing that could not support weight. He told Blair that Sterling was disoriented and unreliable, that Rowan Hale was a technically marginal former employee whose record was a matter of documented fact, and that allowing him to involve himself in the company's most significant transaction would define her leadership in a way that could not be corrected. He offered, in the same level tone, to arrange a formal correction of Rowan's professional record and a settlement that would remove the matter from consideration before the board convened. Blair declined without explanation, She set the phone on the cockpit ledge without disconnecting the call, which meant the remainder was passively recorded, then looked across the flight deck at Rowan and said he had heard it. He had. He also observed that the woman who had walked through his hangar door 2 nights ago had been replaced, not by someone diminished, but by someone more honest. And he acknowledged without ceremony that the name Ashford was not a sufficient description of the person who carried it. The Gulfstream lifted from the runway just before 5 in the morning, engines smooth in the cold pre-dawn air, the vibration of the airframe transmitting through the seat and control column in a way Rowan had not felt in 11 years, and had told himself on many intervening days that he did not miss. He had not been entirely truthful with himself about that, and the knowledge arrived with unexpected warmth. They climbed through 15,000 feet, then 20, the instrument scan nominal across every gauge in June's recorder, logging clean lines of operational data. Blair looked out the window at the landscape below and said she understood now why someone whose natural orientation was three-dimensional would struggle to restrict his existence to ground level indefinitely. Rowan said he had not found it difficult. He had found it necessary, which were not the same thing. He did not say that this was the first time he had been at the controls of a jet aircraft since the afternoon 11 years ago when the ramp crew had walked past him without making eye contact. He did not need to say it. When the altimeter crossed 28,000 feet, a warning tone sounded twice, and the pressurization display showed the cabin altitude beginning to climb without any corresponding input from either seat. The cabin pressure advisory escalated to a caution condition in 40 seconds, materially faster than any normal seal failure, and telling Rowan immediately that this was an active command being delivered to the pressurization valve from a source other than the cockpit. The oxygen masks deployed from their overhead housings correctly, which was the one element of the emergency sequence functioning as designed. Rowan told Blair to secure her mask, find the emergency procedures checklist card at her right knee, and begin reading from the cabin pressure abnormal section in sequence, without skipping items and without looking out the windows. Spatial disorientation at altitude was an additional hazard they did not need. Blair hesitated approximately 2 seconds, then the mask was on and the card was in her hand. She read each item clearly and confirmed each completion in a steady register. And Rowan was aware, in the portion of his attention not fully occupied with managing the aircraft, that she was performing under a magnitude of stress that routinely damaged the composure of far more experienced people, and doing it because sometime in the previous 48 hours she had reached a decision about whether Rowan Hale's instructions were worth following. He called for the autopilot to execute an emergency descent to 10,000 feet. The autopilot accepted the input and then did not execute it, the aircraft holding altitude as if the command had been reviewed and set aside. The Rogue module had achieved integration with the flight management system that extended beyond the pressurization circuit alone. He disengaged the autopilot and took direct manual control. Blair reported through the intercom, without shifting her register, that the secondary circuit diagram on the co-pilot display showed the unauthorized module generating a command string addressed to the pressurization valve at approximately 4 cycles per second. Rowan told her to begin isolating the module's power bus by working through the circuit breaker panel at her right knee in the sequence he described, 1 breaker at a time from the bottom row upward. The 3rd breaker she pulled caused the main cockpit display to go dark, eliminating primary navigation and engine monitoring, but the mechanical standby instruments on the glare shield panel continued to function, which was the reason those instruments were required to be installed, and the reason he had verified each one during pre-flight. The module was drawing power through a secondary path that Blair identified by tracing the circuit diagram with her finger on the darkened display glass, reading the printed overlay still visible beneath the dead screen. She described her finding and asked whether she should cut the secondary bus or hold it to allow June's recorder to continue capturing the module's output. This was the question that carried the actual weight of the moment. Cutting the bus would protect them from continued pressure loss at altitude, and holding it would allow the recorder to capture the complete command authorization signature that would make the evidence legally conclusive. Rowan said the decision was hers as much as his because her life was involved in the outcome in an equal and non-hypothetical way. Blair said to hold the bus. She said it without hesitation and without framing it as a sacrifice, and then added that her reason was not the company or the acquisition, but the specific and uncomplicated fact that this technology was currently being considered for installation in commercial aircraft, and the people who would sit above it had no reason to know what it was capable of. The recorder completed its capture cycle. Rowan called it aloud. Blair pulled the secondary bus breaker and the module went dark, and Rowan initiated a maximum rate emergency descent within the aircraft's structural envelope. A weather system that had not appeared on the pre-departure forecast had developed over the primary airfield, ceiling conditions below safe approach minimums, and the controller advised to divert. Rowan knew the alternate. An 8,000-foot strip 20 miles northeast that had served as the base for the test flight program during years when he had needed a runway long enough to abort at high speed. He briefed the approach in compressed, specific language, and Blair read back speeds and altitudes at each fix in the same register, and the exchange between them had the rhythm of a crew that had been flying together long enough to trust the other person's call-out. The Gulfstream crossed the threshold at exactly the correct airspeed, touched down firmly in the touchdown zone, and rolled to a stop with runway remaining. After the engines spooled down and the shutdown checklist was complete, Blair sat for a moment with her head back against the headrest, and then she was crying, quietly and without performance, the way a person cries when the thing held at a managed distance by concentration is finally permitted to arrive and be what it is. Rowan sat beside her and said nothing, because he understood from experience that the body's accounting of a close call follows its own timeline and does not benefit from redirection. June's voice came over the radio a few minutes later. The data capture was complete. The command authorization string bore the digital signature of the administrative account registered to Von Carrington, and its syntactic structure was identical to commands appearing in a recovered archive from the test flight program 11 years earlier. She paused, and then said there was a second authorization signature in the file. It read, S. Ashford. Blair said the second signature proved her father had been behind the entire operation from the beginning, and Rowan understood the certainty because the surface of the evidence was constructed to support exactly that conclusion. He asked June to extract the timestamp metadata because a signature's meaning depends entirely on the sequence in which it was applied relative to the events it documented. The extraction required 40 minutes of detailed work. When June read the result, the sequence it revealed was not what Blair had assumed. Sterling Ashford's signature had been placed on the authorization file in the 48 hours following the test flight incident. Not before it, not concurrent with it, but after Carrington had already delivered the command that produced the pressurization fault, and after Rowan had already been walked off the property. Sterling had not designed the sabotage. He had discovered it after the fact and signed a document that sealed the operational record, prevented disclosure, protected Carrington from accountability, and sustained a narrative about Rowan Hale that Sterling had known at the moment of signing was not supported by what had actually happened. Blair reached her father's care team at the hospital and arranged a brief monitored call. Sterling's speech was halting, but his comprehension was intact, and his precision was that of a man spending whatever clarity he had left on getting the words right. He did not ask to be forgiven. He told Rowan that he had calculated that public scandal would destroy a company representing employment for several thousand people, and that he had told himself this justified the choice. He said he had known in the moment he signed the document that the justification was not adequate, and that 11 years of returning to that knowledge had not changed his assessment. Rowan listened without interrupting. Sterling then said that Carrington was pursuing the current acquisition because the defective technology had been refined and incorporated into the flight management systems included in the deal, and that once the transaction closed, liability for any future incidents would transfer to the acquiring entity, making the original evidence legally remote and practically difficult to pursue. He said he had sent Blair to Rowan because Rowan was the only person who had ever refused a flight request from him on the specific grounds that the aircraft was not yet safe to carry passengers, and that Sterling had spent 11 years being wrong about whether that quality of judgment represented an inconvenience or the only thing worth trusting. Rowan said he did not want money. Sterling began a sentence moving in the direction of a financial arrangement, and Rowan interrupted him and said again, simply, that he did not want money. He said he wanted 3 things: the original investigation report released publicly in its complete and unredacted form, financial compensation for every engineer and technician who had been pressured into a non-disclosure agreement, and every aircraft operating with any version of the compromised module grounded until an independent examiner had cleared it. Sterling said he would ensure all 3 were done. Blair said she would hold him to that personally. Before the call ended, Sterling told Blair that he had sent her to find someone who could stop the company from making the same mistake a second time, and that the person she had found had done something beyond what he had asked. Blair stood at the edge of the airstrip after the call ended, holding the phone against her chest, and said to Rowan that she had grown up being the person people brought requests to, the final signature, the name at the top of the structure, and that she had very nearly confused that position with being genuinely known, which was a different thing from being needed or used. Rowan said that her father had used her, yes, but what she had done at 30,000 feet with degraded systems and limited oxygen supply was entirely her own and carried no Ashford qualification. June came back over the radio. Carrington had convened an emergency board session 3 hours earlier than the scheduled meeting and was preparing a motion to remove Blair from the CEO position on grounds of unauthorized use of company assets. They arrived at the Ashford Aeronautics Tower, with Blair still in the shop coveralls she had been wearing for the better part of 2 days, fabric carrying the accumulated evidence of every disassembly and 1 high-altitude emergency, and Rowan in the clothes he had been wearing when she came through his hangar door. June carried a hard case with 3 physical copies of all recorded data, one of which had been transmitted electronically to the National Transportation Safety Board's Aviation Safety Division before they left the airstrip, another to the independent audit firm retained by the company's directors and officers' liability insurer. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor to Carrington's voice already in progress inside the conference room, the board session underway for 12 minutes. Carrington was presenting his removal motion when Blair walked in and stood at the head of the table. He told the board she had been absent during a critical commercial period, had operated company aircraft without authorization or safety committee review, and had placed herself under the influence of a former employee whose separation had been documented on grounds of professional misconduct. He recommended her immediate administrative suspension and authorization of the acquisition vote to proceed under the acting chairman. Blair did not respond to any of his characterization. she cast her presentation to the conference room display and walked the board through the evidence in the sequence she and Rowan had organized. The component discrepancies in the maintenance documentation, the unauthorized secondary module and its fabricated certification, the operational data from the flight, the command authorization strings bearing Carrington's digital signature, and the structural identity between those commands and archived records from the test flight incident 11 years earlier. She presented each item without elaboration because the evidence did not require her interpretation. June confirmed that the recorded data had been collected under her direct supervision, had not passed through any Ashford-controlled network at any point, and that copies had been transmitted to external entities before either Blair or Rowan had entered the building. Carrington stated that the data had been fabricated by a disgruntled former employee acting in coordination with Blair. Blair told the board that the source of the evidence was also a man who had grounded an aircraft 11 years ago to prevent exactly the kind of incident that the current evidence demonstrated had been deliberately engineered, and that his assessment of flight safety had been validated comprehensively by the events of the preceding 24 hours. Blair then disclosed the portion of the evidence that implicated her own father. She did not minimize it, and did not frame it in terms favorable to the legacy Sterling had spent a lifetime building, because she had decided during the pre-dawn hours on that emergency airstrip that a company built on a concealed history of harm was not a company worth protecting in its current form, and that the thing worth protecting was the process of correction. A recorded statement from Sterling, made with his care team's awareness, was played for the board. Carrington suggested Blair stay silent to protect the company and her father's legacy. Blair said a legacy built on unsafe aircraft was not worth protecting. The session continued for another 40 minutes and concluded with the board voting to suspend Carrington pending criminal referral, to terminate the acquisition, and to commission an independent safety review of every aircraft in the company's certificated fleet. Before the meeting formally adjourned, Rowan asked that the technical notification to all operators of the compromised module be transmitted before the end of the business day, because the risk was not abstract and not historical. Blair issued the fleet grounding order before the board adjourned, accepting the associated financial consequences without requesting ratification, which was within her executive authority and which communicated something clear about the leadership she intended to provide. The room cleared. Rowan did not remain to receive acknowledgement from any director. When Blair turned to find him, he was already gone, and on the table where he had been standing there was only the Gulfstream's key and a small folded paper on which he had written, "You don't need to do whatever anyone asks anymore. Dosate." 6 months after the board meeting, Von Carrington was indicted on federal charges of records falsification, securities fraud, and obstruction of a safety investigation. The product of a joint inquiry by the National Transportation Safety Board and the Department of Justice that drew on June Halstead's data as its primary evidentiary foundation. Sterling Ashford resigned voluntarily from the board, transferred a substantial portion of his equity into a professionally administered trust, and directed the proceeds to establish a compensation fund for the 31 engineers and maintenance technicians who had been required to sign non-disclosure agreements in the years following the original incident, each of whom received a formal written statement from the company acknowledging what they had been asked to conceal and why the concealment had been wrong. Ashford Aeronautics accepted a significant financial penalty, grounded 11 aircraft pending independent safety certification review, and rebuilt its internal compliance function under a structure of external oversight that Blair had insisted upon as a condition of her continued leadership. The federal inquiry into the 11-year-old test flight incident was reopened, reviewed, and formally closed with a finding that exonerated Rowan Hale of every allegation in the original report and confirmed that his grounding of the aircraft had prevented a likely pressurization failure during a demonstration flight carrying 14 people on its intended passenger manifest. Blair offered him a position as Executive Vice President of Operations with compensation that reflected what she genuinely believed his capabilities were worth. Rowan declined the office and accepted a separate arrangement: the establishment of an independent aviation safety validation center, operating under his direction, located on the grounds of the regional airfield where Hale Aero Works stood, with a mandate to evaluate flight systems without contractual dependency on any manufacturer, operator, or financial interest, answerable only to the technical standards it was created to protect. Hale Aero Works expanded its floor space and updated its equipment in the months that followed. But the sign above the hangar door remained the one Rowan had painted himself during the first winter after his wife died, because the sign said something about continuity that he did not wish to renovate away. Marin came home during a semester break and observed, after watching her father clean the same combination wrench 3 times in 20 minutes, that she could not confirm his hands were in a condition that justified that level of attention to a single tool. Blair arrived without a car service, without staff, and without the particular forward momentum that belongs to a person performing a position rather than inhabiting one. She wore a flight jacket and carried 2 coffees, and she walked through the hangar door the same way she had walked through it on the first night, without hesitating at the threshold. The Gulfstream that had spent 11 years sealed behind Rowan's own certification stamp had been fully restored, independently recertified, and repainted in a plain and unremarkable scheme, now serving as the primary test platform for the Safety Validation Center, carrying no commercial passenger history, only the accumulated flight data of a future being deliberately built on something more durable than institutional silence. Blair asked Rowan whether he had any further requirements for her. He said this time it was not a requirement, it was a question, and the question was whether she wanted to fly at sunrise. She stepped into the aircraft as herself, not as a CEO executing her father's final instruction, not as a daughter honoring an inherited obligation, but as a person who had come through a garage door in the rain and found something she had not known she was missing. The aircraft lifted into the morning light, and Sterling Ashford had sent his daughter to find someone who could save a company, but the man she found had done something that no ledger could record. He had shown her the difference between being sent somewhere and choosing to arrive.